So thank you all so much for taking out the time to be here today for the second episode in our 3-part video podcast series, which is focused on the need for increased female representation in government and policy making in Pakistan. And this specific episode is looking at climate change and environmental injustice and the need for a gender lens in policy making pertaining to climate change and the environment. So I'm very excited today to have 4 very, very distinct voices here with us as part of this conversation. Some of you are environmental lawyers working in litigation and policy, while some of you are human rights activists and campaigners. So I think a very, very crucial opportunity to bring together 4 very different perspectives and talk about not just the common strands that are underpinning each of our work, but also to talk about the differentiations and the divergences. So I'll start off just with a brief round of introductions. And Ms. Aneesa Agha is an environmental lawyer. She is a gender and climate advocate specializing in the renewable energy sector. She is also a leading member of Women in Law. Thank you so much, Aneesa, for being here with us. Mr. Ahmad is an environmental lawyer specializing in the energy, water, natural resources, and urban infrastructure sectors. Mr. Alam is a Yale World Fellow and in the past has served as a member of the Punjab Environmental Protection Council and is chairman of the Lahore Electric Supply Company and the Lahore Waste Management Company. He currently serves as a member of the Pakistan Climate Change Council, as senior advisor to Air Quality Asia, and as member of the Sara Foundation think tank on the rational use of water. Thank you so much, Rafay, for being here. Ms. Rimmel Mohydin is a human rights policy and campaigns expert. Until recently, she led Amnesty International's research and advocacy work in Pakistan, focusing on climate change, enforced disappearances, and freedom of expression. Under her stewardship, Amnesty developed its first campaign against poor air quality and for the protection against extreme weather events, such as heat waves and floods. Previously, she was also the head of communications at Justice Project Pakistan, where her work formed the crucial link between the courts and the public, leading to legal reforms, a shift in public discourse about the death penalty, and the prevention of several execution warrants from being carried out. Thank you so much for being here today. Finally, Ms. Sara Hayat specializes in climate change law and policy and has worked on multiple nuances of climate change in Pakistan, including advising the government in preparing Pakistan's updated Nationally Determined Contributions (NDCs) in 2021. She is an internationally renowned climate advocate and brings Pakistan's climate tide to the forefront. So thank you so much again for distinct voices, for very, very interesting perspectives, and very interested to explore all the different themes that we have in front of us today. But before we do so, I think just a very, very brief context setting would be pertinent. I think, as we can all agree, the climate crisis is not gender neutral. And the UN OHCHR has highlighted the fact that systemic inequalities can lead to climate change impacting women, men, and non-binary persons very, very differently. And there are very disparate effects that it has on each of these categories. But women and girls disproportionately experience the greatest impacts of climate change, which in turn kind of amplifies existing gender inequalities and poses unique threats to their livelihoods, their health, and their safety. And I think as more and more data and research reveal this very clear correlation, it's very important to talk about the disparate impacts of climate change and the linkages between women's empowerment and effective global climate action. So how women are essentially very, very crucial actors in bringing about effective climate action and how they can be important contributors to that process. And I think that it's particularly crucial to have this conversation in the context of Pakistan, where we've seen the impact of the flash floods in 2022. And we've kind of witnessed the very disparate impact that the floods had specifically on women and girls and what the specialized risks and harms were within that context. Another kind of lens that I'm very interested in looking at, which we will in the course of this conversation, is about the recent establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund. The conversations that need to happen around the gendered dimensions of loss and damage, what factors need to be taken into account when developing gender-responsive climate action, as well as mitigation measures. So it's within this broader context that this current conversation on the need for a gender lens in policy making pertaining to the environment and climate change is happening. But I think it's also important to talk about why this conversation is happening now. I think it's important because we have a newly elected government. We unfortunately have an all-male federal cabinet, which has once again highlighted where we are in 2024 and how far we still have to go. So I think at this point in time, it's very important to kind of center these issues and bring them to the government's agenda. But also a very crucial strand in all of this is the role of the European Union's GSP Plus framework, and the fact that 2 of the conventions that are monitored by GSP Plus do pertain to the climate and to the environment, and what Pakistan's obligations are under those conventions. So that was a very long introduction, but I will jump now straight into the first question, which is a general question, and this question is really for everyone, so whoever would like to start off by answering. So there's a growing understanding that the climate crisis is not gender neutral. So I want to ask you, in what ways do women and girls experience the impacts of climate change disproportionately, both globally as well as in Pakistan? And in terms of climate change being a threat multiplier, how does this specifically affect women and girls? So whoever would like to start.
Right. Okay. Sure. I talk a lot about this, so let me be the first to go. The best way to look at the climate impacts on women is actually to sort of divide it into a bunch of areas. The impacts on livelihood, the women's role as a central figure in a household, water, natural disasters, and also migration. So there were 5 areas in which women are impacted more inequitably than men when it comes to climate change. I'll touch upon a few and then everybody else can, there's a very long answer. So as far as cultural constraints are concerned, because women are the primary caretakers in households, and obviously like a lot of this is not just rural, but some of it is just pertaining to rural women, but then culturally women are caretakers even in an urban setting. But environmental injustice falls more heavily on women in the rural parts of Pakistan. But coming back to the answer, so culturally women are responsible for cooking, for cleaning, for looking after children, their in-laws, husbands, every baby there is basically in a household. And when we talk to these women, and I did go and speak to a lot of them in central Sindh, they say, we don't have access to firewood, so we can't cook for our kids or for our in-laws, and then that in turn becomes a problem. They say we don't have access to water, we can't clean our houses, we can't cook again, we can't give our children some clean water to drink. And all of this sort of comes together with in-laws being tough. Domestic violence increases because of this, because husbands get aggravated. Then when it comes to water collection, now there's a study by Oxfam that suggests that women will travel about 2 kilometers on foot, sometimes multiple times a day, to collect water in many parts of Pakistan, rural settings. Whilst doing this, and this will tie in with international impacts on women also, or how climate change affects women internationally, even in many parts of the African continent, women are traveling long distances to collect water. This is in harsh circumstances. They are more vulnerable to harsh and non-clement weather, whether it's raining, whether it's hot, whether it's very cold. These women are more vulnerable to sexual harassment. They're more vulnerable to attacks by wild animals. And when I spoke to these women in Pakistan, they said something that's very close to our hearts. Most women, they said, we carry water in metal pans on our heads. When we do that, we experience hair loss. We get headaches. They said we get backaches. All of these, when we talk about them, it just seems like, oh, she got a headache, but that's not what it is. It's like a daily thing. It's a big thing for them. Then then livelihood, because climate change is impacting agriculture. I'm sure somebody or the other will talk a lot about it. Because women in many parts of Pakistan, their only source of income really is agriculture or land-based. With climate change impacting agriculture, women lose out on their main source of income. That means they can no longer bring income. Their only security got taken away from them. Climate migration is a big thing, long topic. But again, climate-induced migration. But Pakistan, I think right now we're estimating about 30 million people have already moved. And this number is set to go a lot higher in the coming years. By 2050, they're predicting a much, much scarier figure. For women, climate migration means that they will sleep on the fields alongside men. And they complain of lack of privacy. Their rights to privacy are infringed. They say that we work all day with our husbands or male caretakers, male caretakers, and then at night we stay up to look after our children. So basically for them it's much tougher. They're more exposed to attacks by wild animals. In Sindh, I spoke to some medical practitioners, and they said that women a lot of women who approach them are suffering from a lot of mental illnesses, and mostly I think what they were getting at was depression, but they didn't have enough evidence to corroborate it. And he said, and the doctor, 2-3 doctors that I spoke to, they said that a lot of this is linked to the weather. So eco-anxiety is one thing, like eco-related mental illnesses are another that women are more vulnerable to. These doctors also said something along the lines of women being susceptible to urinary tract infections. And this is especially true in climate migration, because women do not have the privacy or in our part of the world, sort of the cultural freedom. So they will wait till after sunset, or they will go off to like a more secluded area, which leaves them more vulnerable to attacks by animals, sexual harassment, etc. So that's another thing. And then lastly, just rounding up, natural disasters affect women a lot more than they affect men. And this also has a cultural undertone to it. For example, in our part of the world, including Bangladesh and India, I'm going to take the liberty of sort of accumulating this jurisdiction. Religion factors in very heavily into whatever we are doing. And in Bangladesh, when the cyclones came in 2002, a lot of women died just because they didn't want to be rescued by men who they were not related to. So they wouldn't allow, helpers to carry them or take them out of their houses in helicopters because they just didn't want that kind of physical contact. And a big reason why women are more vulnerable to natural disasters than men is because men have the privilege of learning how to swim as kids here, or of climbing trees. They just have more liberty. These are basic life-saving skills women just don't get to acquire. And in fact, by some estimates, 14 times more women than men die in natural disasters. So yeah, I think that just a very quick, very superficially rounded up answer.
Thank you so much, Sara. That was very incisive. Would anyone else like to contribute to this particular question?
I mean, just to tack on what Sara's excellent summary was, it's there's a lot of basic things that are not even necessarily just survival skills, but just basically ways that people can cope with extreme weather events. So, for example, Amnesty did some research in Agha, and even something as basic as a lot of men sort of rely on taking showers in the day or jumping into whatever water body is nearby, and it's okay for them to walk around with wet clothes getting into their bodies. Women can't do that. Similarly, as Sara said, a lot of them don't have cooling mechanisms, even basic ventilation in their houses at night. And these are places which hit temperatures of wet bulb temperatures of, unless I've watched the figures, at 47 degrees Celsius or something. So, but I'll have to check that figure again, maybe we can edit that later. But they can't sleep outside because, again, that exposes them to harassment, gender-based violence, attacks by other men who aren't around. So there's a lot of small steps that men can take when they are particularly vulnerable, when they are sort of burdened by poverty, and they can't do that simply because, as Sara said, there are lots of cultural barriers, there's lots of structural reasons why they just can't even access something as simple as that. And I think another critical aspect that probably is characteristic of the entire region is that women are also denied land ownership, right? And they're also a part of they're relying on natural resources which are depleting before their eyes. It's becoming an unreliable way for them to figure out what they're doing with their lives. So it all sort of accumulates, as you said, it is a multiplier.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as you guys both said, the risks are disproportionate. And I'm really interested now in coming to the context in Pakistan vis-a-vis public interest litigation. And so I'll direct the next question to you, Aneesa. The salient case in the realm of rights-based litigation in Pakistan was the consequence of a petition that was filed in the Lahore High Court in February 2019 by a coalition of women, including yourself. And I would love to ask you about that petition, which was titled Maria Khan versus the Federation of Pakistan. Among other very, very important points, the petition argued that since climate change has a disproportionate impact on women, the government's climate inaction violates plaintiffs' rights to equal protection under the law. and no discrimination on the basis of sex. So I'm very, very interested in hearing you talk a little bit about this petition, what the outcome of the case was, and also what implications this has going forward.
So the petition was filed. Pakistan was being celebrated as at the forefront of climate litigation, while at the same time there would be meetings in the power sector discussing putting up 6,000 megawatts of coal. So, and the power sector was the space that I was working in. And so the petition was really born out of this sense of like cognitive dissonance, that are we on the same planet? Because here's the judiciary and the executive arms of the state signaling that Pakistan is undertaking climate action, whereas in reality, like when we actually look at what is climate action, it's about energy, it's about agriculture, it's about transport, industry. It is not just what the climate ministry does. So out of that sense of frustration, and also to highlight the disproportionate impact of climate change, as already summarized by Sara and Rimmel, we wanted to highlight that. So the petition seeks government action on implementing renewable energy projects, especially given that at the time of filing the petition, renewable energy had become cheaper, and by renewable energy I mean solar and wind power, had become cheaper compared to fossil fuel based energy. And we were successful in getting an initial order, but then there was COVID, and it is hard for me to characterize nothing concrete has emanated from the petition as yet. So it's hard for me to characterize it as a success in any way, except perhaps as a starting point for a conversation on the disproportionate impact of climate change on women and how that impacts their right to equality. And secondly, that all state action is climate action. So the power sector is the climate sector. Mm-hmm. The Minister of Industries and Production is the de facto climate minister. The Agriculture Minister is the Environment Minister.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. That was incredibly insightful. I have a follow-up question, and I think I'll direct this to you, Rafay. Vis-a-vis the devolution that came about as a result of the 18th Amendment, how does that play out in the context of not having a centralized policy, but kind of having it spread out over each province? Is there a difficulty in coordinating those efforts across ministries that's kind of exacerbated by that, or do you think that there could be a kind of model for a centralized policy that could still be kind of created and then maybe have that followed in provinces?
I don't think a centralized policy is a good idea, because climate context changes depending on where you are in Pakistan. KPK has mountains, Balochistan and Sindh have oceans, which the other provinces don't, and within provinces as well, North and South Punjab flood differently. You can't have a one-size-fits-all federal policy. I tend not to agree with it. Also, most of the things you'll see in the federal policy with regards to agriculture, with regards to livestock, with regards to human resources, even in mitigation when it comes to things like transport and better urban planning to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from methane and so on and so forth, these are all responsibilities of provincial governments, all of them. And if the federal policy sets out a list of initiatives that you're going to do irrigation infrastructure improvement to improve flood resilience, well, that infrastructure has to be paid for by the provinces who own the infrastructure, and that payment can only be made if a provincial assembly in a budget session sanctions that money. So in many ways, a centralized federal policy on climate change writes checks that the provinces who weren't asked are forced to cash, and it makes the implementation of these policies very difficult. I think as an alternative, we need to have grounds up based policies, provincial policies that feed into a federal policy, if at all. And the Federation is then responsible for coordinating with the UN and other agencies on international obligations, and then sorting that information down to the provinces so that it can be properly communicated. This is not just true for climate, this is true for things like labor, things like human rights as well. Wherever Pakistan signed international agreements, where the implementation of those agreements are really provincial responsibilities. And really the future, therefore, and I hope it can be done through climate change and climate governance, is better federal cooperation, sharing information from the ground up to the Federation, rather than the other way around as it is today.
To what extent, and I'll ask you this, Sara, to what extent are climate change policies that currently are being implemented in provinces, where these policies do exist, to what extent are these policies gender inclusive, and what are the gaps?
Right, just to take a step back, Noor, so in Pakistan, after the 18th Amendment, the environment was devolved to the provinces. The climate remains a bit of a grey area, but it has also subsequently devolved to the provinces. I think Rafay has summed it up very articulately. But the control remains with the federal government. The climate control, at least in my opinion, definitely remains with the federal government. The main climate act is federal. The national climate change policy is federal. And the National Adaptation Plan, which is right now our governing, let's say, the most important of our policies, again in my opinion, because this is the policy that's going to bring about whatever we've embedded into the NDCs, the Nationally Determined Contributions, which are Pakistan's pledges on what we intend to do for climate change. This sets the roadmap for the adaptation plan is going to set the roadmap for it. As far as the provincial policies are concerned, Punjab has formed a provincial policy that has been in the pipeline since 2018 or 21.
Since the Asghar Lagari case.
Since the Asghar Lagari case, and it just sort of remains as a draft on the EPD website. And then if you meet them, they say it's coming out next week. Every time you meet them, they say it's coming out next week. Balochistan does not have one. Khyber Pakhtunkhwa had one and now has a revised and updated one as well, which is amazing. And Sindh has a new policy, either 2018 or 2022, I'm not sure, one of the two, but definitely a better one than Punjab's draft, in my opinion, because it's shorter, more comprehensive. These policies talk about gender. So it's kind of like, there are two ways to look at it. Either it's forced into these policies because, gender has to be mentioned to get some kind of acclaim nationally or internationally. Or, and forgive me for being very abrupt, I think money just doesn't come unless you talk about gender anymore. So, and the provinces are cognizant of it, and that's why they put it. But my point is that if you're adding gender into a policy, then, and again, it's very personal and I hope everybody will jump in, I don't think you need to sort of stick there and scream gender. I think gender mainstreaming should just be like instinctive now. Our policies should be gender neutral. You don't need to put women or the elderly or disabled. These words should just not exist. Our policies should be holistic enough to cater to everybody. As far as the existing policies go, whenever the term gender comes in, it comes in context of getting women more involved agriculturally, and getting women and they're creating more jobs in the power sector for women, or natural disasters, because women are definitely more adversely impacted. Like in the 2022 floods, damning statistics came out. Pregnant women were about 60,000 pregnant women were giving birth during the floods, diseases and infections, and so these things. And I just want to add that the government is aware of them. Policymakers are aware of it. They do want to, I think, inject them into the policies for whatever their reasons are. But I feel like it shouldn't be a very glaring thing anymore. It should just be like, it's there. We should all know it. That's what I think. I know you guys should.
Absolutely. I think this is a really good point to also talk about the kind of broader international law context underpinning this conversation, now that we're talking about domestic implementation and the extent to which it does live up to, kind of the labels that surround gender-responsive climate action. So I want to ask you guys again, and Rimmel, I think if you could also add, to this question, just about what the international law framework is when it comes to climate change and the environment, the various conventions that Pakistan has signed and ratified, how is implementation monitored, also in the context of the GSP Plus framework, and in what way do they kind of lay out very clear guidelines for what gender responsive climate action should look like?
All of us, one by one. The umbrella instrument most important is the Paris Agreement, and we are a signatory to it. Almost all countries on earth are, I think, barring two. Trump had created a bit of a havoc with it, but I think that also backfired. We became a signatory to the Paris Agreement, and through the Climate Change Act of 2017, which is a federal act, really doesn't deal with any of the grassroots issues of climate change, but forms a couple of councils authority council financing mechanism, important. And then the Paris Agreement falls under the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change. Apart from that, we have like Aneesa said, and I will revert to her for this. That's an excellent point. When she said the energy minister is a climate minister, the agriculture minister is a climate minister, So that means pretty much all international conventions that we are signatory to or party to should be climate. Something on the energy.
Rafay, I remember you wrote an article about this, which is, I think, this broader idea that I feel like the government of Pakistan often hides behind now, which is that, we didn't cause climate change, so we're not really responsible.
Yeah.
And so while it is true, absolutely, there's a colonial history here, there is a lot of, I suppose, there's been a lot of theft from the global south, which we are now bearing the brunt of. And unfortunately, I feel like this broader sort of approach that the government of Pakistan has towards international legal obligations as far as climate change is concerned, and please feel free to disagree with me because I hope I'm wrong. People, they sort of hide behind this cover because it is at the end of the day completely valid, but when it comes to taking steps at home and as far as implementation is concerned, there are things that can be done here which aren't necessarily dependent on I suppose getting all this money from the UNFCCC, from different countries in the global north, European countries, whatever, and that simply hasn't happened. Something as simple as the Punjab climate change policy hasn't been updated in God knows how many years, right?
It's a draft policy.
It's
not even a policy.
It's not even a policy, right? And so
rough framework policy.
Rough framework policy. So my point is that there is very little action that has been taken in Pakistan and I think they often use this as a crutch that, hey, we didn't cause this, we went abroad, we went to COP27, we went to COP28, we did all this representation, we're responsible for this. And look, there are things that Pakistan should be commended for in terms of bringing the plight of the global south to a global stage and making it clear. And for that, credit where credit is due, that's great. But, like Aneesa said, you can't have a climate change minister that's all gung-ho about all of these reforms that are taking place, but at the same time be green-lighting coal power plants. So this sense of, it's quite disjointed, and I feel like Pakistan is very, very comfortable with collecting accolades and being like, hey, we're the first ones to do this, we're the first ones to do that, we have a climate change ministry, we have a climate change ministry, and unfortunately that doesn't really seem to translate too much, which is why when it comes to actual implementation of any policies or any obligations or fulfilling any obligations, they kind of take cover behind, hey, we didn't cause this, so don't look at us. And that's always something that's a bit uncomfortable.
Yeah, just to play the devil's advocate, we didn't cause it.
True, we didn't cause it, but I think the Paris Agreement, as signatories, we still have the duty of common but differentiated responsibilities. So what does differentiated mean? And this is something we highlighted in the petition, is that as an economic decision, if renewable energy is cheaper, your regulator is saying it is cheaper per unit of electricity, then why is it that for the next 25 years, the decisions that you're making, and these power plants have a life of 25 to 30 years, then why are these decisions being made right now which are completely contrary to that like whatever basic level of differentiated responsibility we do have as signatories. So yes, we did not cause climate change, and we're still close to 1% of global greenhouse emissions. But I think this also links back to the local impacts of climate change. So when it comes to mitigation measures, the mitigation measures for climate change overlap a lot with air pollution and the mitigation measures we need to implement for reducing smog. So if we did take on responsibility as to how we should take on responsibility, then we would realize that, you know, if we switch to renewable energy and if we switch to higher quality fuel or electric vehicles, then that will have follow-on impacts in terms of air quality, which is something that Punjab and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa are both provinces that, you know, for 4 to 5 months a year are completely, I mean, it's impossible to live.
What's the figures? It's, anyone in a Pakistani city loses 2 years of life expectancy on average, and in Lahore it's higher, it's close to 7-8 years of life expectancy. And that's just air pollution, most of which is greenhouse gases. And I know you're absolutely right, Rimmel, that I think it's the first paragraph of our climate policy where we say we're a very small greenhouse gas emitter, but we're very vulnerable. But as Ali Tawqir Sheikh, last time we met, was talking, there are plenty of other countries that produce less than 1% greenhouse gas, but you know, they're perfectly resilient. Take Bangladesh, much more resilient. Norway produces less greenhouse gases than Pakistan. So it's a figure you hide behind. And we hide behind it, and you're absolutely right. We, you know, claim loss, and we were the poster child for loss and damage at COP27. But the week before our delegation went there, the entire Pakistani government was in Tharparkar inaugurating a coal-fired power plant. And you can't do these sorts of things. So there is this face we put on with this excuse of कि जी ये common but differentiated responsibilities में हमारी ज़िम्मेदारी नहीं है, and therefore we can do whatever we want with our industrial policy, our transport policy, EV policy, energy policy, doesn't matter.
I'm really glad that you mentioned COP27 because that's a really good segue to my next question. So obviously establishing a fund for loss and damage was one of the key achievements of COP27, but the fund has yet to be operationalized and the contours are kind of still being worked out. So I'm interested in asking you, because I know you were at that COP, were the gendered dimensions of loss and damage, particularly in the context of South Asia,
It's a very easy. No, they weren't. The big fight was to get countries to agree on the establishment of a fund, right? And there were plenty holding out. And so 27 mein तय हो गया कि fund होगा, and then there was a transitional committee that was going to answer the important questions about how a fund would work. I mean, importantly, who pays into a fund? And under what objective criteria are you going to turn to Japan and say itne paise dalo, ya to the Germany? What are the criteria? And similarly for developing countries, you know, not all of whom have stellar reputations when it comes to financial transparency. What guarantees do you have giving us that the money we give you will be used for the people in the communities most affected by climate impacts? Then COP28 comes along. Most of those questions remain unanswered, but we did manage to get some pledges into into the loss and damage fund, and we agreed sub-optimally to have the World Bank host the fund until some sort of permanent institution can't be created. The amounts pledged into the loss and damage fund are laughably small. For example, the United States pledged $17 million, $17 million, and in its second round of funding for the Israeli genocide has agreed to $18 billion over the $13 billion it gave a year ago. So paise hain, but they're just not coming into it. And this is the great climate hypocrisy and climate injustice being played out, not just for countries like Pakistan, but many other countries that are being pummeled by the climate crisis. It's almost laughably sick.
Yeah, absolutely. Sara, would you like to add anything?
No, I think Rafay is the best person to talk about the loss and damage fund, except that I will add that if a loss and damage fund is supposed to cater to slow on-site climate events, it means that it will cater to women. Like that, I mean, there's just no two ways about it. So it doesn't have to have the word gender sort of forced into it at any point, because climate change affects women more, it affects us disproportionately, more inequitably. Slow onset climate change, which basically means climate change as it's happening right now is affecting women more and at any given point. So the fund is for women more than it is for men. That's just
That's incredibly insightful, and thank you for kind of reiterating that. So my next question, I think, just going back to the concept of increased representation, because in mainstream discourse, I think that there's often this distinction that's made between policy issues that are seen as female-centric, like gender-based violence, reproductive health, versus what are referred to as quote-unquote neutral policy areas. And I think that the environment and climate change oftentimes is characterized as that, and obviously the entire purpose of this conversation has been to kind of try and deconstruct that misconception and to talk about why climate change is a gendered issue, and also to talk about why there's a need for not just a gender lens when it comes to policy making, but also increased female representation. So my next question is going to be about that, and this question again is really for everyone. So in terms of gender responsive climate action, why is increased female representation in legislative and policy making bodies, as well as the judiciary, and the empowerment of women in the context of climate change important, but also necessary? And how will this bring about a gender sensitive and gender inclusive approach?
Like I said, for me, all state action is climate action, and state inaction is climate inaction. So even whatever ministry or government department or judiciary, like if a judge is deciding on the constitutionality of a tax on industry, that is a climate decision. And I think the lack of female representation in decision-making roles, whether that's the government or the judiciary, that impacts women's right to equality, because for two reasons for me. One is, of course, women have the right to representation. They need to see women in power because they will be impacted by these decisions. And secondly, because for me, it is important that caregivers are making decisions. So for me, like who takes care of kids, who takes care of sick and elderly people, the short answer to that is women. I mean, yes, there are exceptions and there are nuances, but generally it is women. So I think decisions that do not have women, I think decisions that are made in rooms where women are not present then suffer from basically having consequences that are completely unintended. And we've seen that play out in the smog litigation that we've had in Punjab. Because, it's been almost 10 years now. Every year, whenever it gets smoggy, there's a petition at the High Court, they shut down schools. And to my mind, it is just not possible for somebody who has taken care of kids, who has sat through online classes, it is impossible not to realize how big a decision that is, that you're playing with the lives of children. And also that nothing is changing in air quality. Because, I feel that if more women were in the judiciary or in the rooms where these types of decisions are being made, then it's much easier to kind of just raise your voice and say, no, I don't think that will change anything.
Just to Aneesa's point, I'd like to draw a parallel with another act that was passed in Pakistan. Pakistan was given a lot of international credit for it, which was the Transgender Rights Act. And the reason why that act was an example for the world was because transgender people were involved in designing it. They were in the rooms, they were consulting on it. They told it, which is why Pakistan, before obviously the conservatives got to it, there was an understanding of what gender is because transgender people were leading the charge. And so that really sort of goes to show, and it was an all-encompassing act. It recognized the importance of self-identifying your gender. It recognized the places that they face the most discrimination, what the structural barriers are to their social integration, and it's because it was informed by their lived experience. And that is why I think that it is really important to recognize that the victims of climate change are just not in the rooms. Even people like us, we are, of course, everybody's impacted by climate change, but we have the means to be able to deal with them. We can get air purifiers. We can hire people to come and take care of our kids when they're sitting at home and doing homeschooling or whatever. So it's just they have an example of what works right before their very eyes, and it's just not something that they're catching on. The reason why that act was a legislative triumph was because they were in the room.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an incredibly important distinction to make.
I want to piggyback a little and just add that men cannot think for women the way women can think for women. I cannot stress enough about this. Men will forget what women
they've cared for.
Or who they've cared for. Absolutely. Only what Aneesa and Rimmel can think of as women for another woman is, I'm sorry, Rafay, but
you're absolutely right.
Which is for example, with the floods, I think, and from the horse's mouth, it seems like a lot of women had needed hygiene products, and they needed menstrual hygiene products, and men were
natal care
and prenatal.
You got
care,
everyone
absolutely.
tents, but
yes,
nothing for women.
Yes,
because they weren't in the decision making at the disaster relief level.
Yes, or वो कोई बाहर से कोई आया, somebody was sending money and they said, oh, you know what, then, or some NGO in some women-led NGO in I think Punjab who started sending sanitary products, and so little things like these, these only women can think for women, and which is why you just need them around. It's just no. But एक और चीज़ जो मैं कहना चाहूँगी, on the other side of the fence, Pakistan has a climate gender policy. It's called something along those lines, but it is a gendered policy on the impacts of climate change on women. It's come out of Sindh. Sindh is, by the way, taking the lead on most climate work in Pakistan. And this policy was formulated after a lot of stakeholder discussion, and I've heard there was a lot of women involved in making it. So I do want to add the good thing.
That's very reassuring.
And to me, that's a gender neutral statement. That's why I say caregivers should be part of the decision. I think men can be too, but first, they need to bear the brunt of caring for people who are impacted by those decisions.
Yeah, I do think that, of course they do add a different dimension to it. So I think in this context, like we've said, first and foremost, I think it is about sort of documenting the lived experiences of the marginalized communities that are affected by them. And then of course you bring other stakeholders to the table contingent on expertise. No one's excluding them altogether. But I think this brings me very, very nicely to my next question, which was actually about how the development and assessment and formulation of policies and funding programs, particularly in the aftermath of the Loss and Damage Fund, whenever it's operationalized, how those can be made gender responsive, and how we can ensure that the requisite number of female decision makers are brought to the table in those conversations. So whoever would like to take that.
Well, I think I'm going to state the most obvious first. I think we want a female for a climate minister.
Yes.
We 100% want one, and we want somebody who's knowledgeable also on climate change.
About issues that impact climate, which means energy, which means agriculture, which it's
also
not just
the under the Climate Act, the Climate Council, which is the Prime Minister, the Chief Ministers, Ministers of Industry, of Finance, Foreign Affairs, provincial ministers, and then you've got chambers of commerce, you've got academia, and then there's civil society representation. So it comes to about 60-70 people. It's Aisha Khan, Afia Salam, and Raina Saeed Khan are the only women. And last year, during the interim government, Dr. Shamshad Akhtar was a female member. She was the finance minister. And then before that, in PDM, it was Sherry Rahman. And this is unacceptable. It's simply unacceptable. They're very vocal, by the way. In all 2 meetings of the Climate Council, all 3 spoke out loudly against issues that were being discussed.
That's yeah. I mean, the numbers I think speak for themselves. But just in terms of, because I'm interested in how the GSP Plus framework plays into this entire context, because I do understand that it's been a really crucial advocacy tool for a lot of activists, and it's been a way for us to kind of get the requisite reforms pushed through, where and when they were needed. So within the context of climate change, and specifically gendered climate action, how do you see the role of GSP Plus? Like, I'm interested in knowing about what the last assessment report said vis-a-vis how effective gender responsive climate action has been, and if there are any gaps, what were the gaps that were identified, if anyone would like to talk about that.
I think Europeans like their cotton shirts and leather jackets far more than the implementation of climate and environment treaties and labor treaties and human rights treaties in countries like Pakistan. If you were to do a good look at the application of these laws, both nationally and subnationally, there are plenty of lacunas that the European Union could pull at for us. But most of the time it's usually been forcing a moratorium on capital punishment more than anything else.
And also, I think like the GSP Plus framework is more European centric. Like, it's for their benefit, really. And I can talk about it in terms of trade, because that's some part I'm acquainted with. If they want eco-friendly products, it's not because they want Pakistan to become green. It's because they don't want themselves to come under any kind of international pressure or human rights infringement or XYZ. It's mostly for them. Like the GSP, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's mostly for them.
Yeah.
It's not about making us a better place. No.
The offloading of a lot of manufacturing and industry to third world countries, moving the pollution here while enjoying the benefits of a better environment over there, based on it's sort of neo-colonialism.
Yeah, but I'm looking at the textile under GSP. I've just looked at it a little, and they do want the textile industry to be green. Otherwise, you can't import into Europe. But it's not because they want Pakistan to have better air quality. That's my problem with it. It's because they themselves want products that are,
and I think one thing that has to be sort of kept into very deep consideration is that there has to be a just transition. If you do decide to become, change all your mechanisms, and you have eco-friendly textile industries, or you have factories that comply with certain requirements, ultimately, as we've seen in Pakistan, as when the pandemic hit, the first people that they go for are their laborers, are their workers. And so you have to ensure that whenever you do make the shift towards greener energy or sort of environmentally friendly policies or whatever, like, you have to make sure that the people who you're trying to protect are not the ones who are then in the front lines. And that very often is the case. And so even when Europe or the GSP Plus sort of prescribes a certain standard that they want us to follow, what are the various means of protection that they're also offering or supporting or calling for to ensure that you don't have a woman who's making a salary and supporting her family in a textile industry, and now that the cleaner machine has come to help her, now she's out of a job on the streets. So that just transition is also a huge part of climate justice.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very crucial conversation that needs to be had within that context. But I'll ask you the last question, Rimmel, because I know that you've worked extensively on advocacy and campaigning on climate change, particularly at Amnesty. So my question is, how can civil rights activists and CSOs in Pakistan in general effectively advocate and lobby for the use of funds to prioritize rehabilitative efforts for the most marginalized groups? And that includes women as well as other groups, of course. But then also in terms of a more gender-inclusive approach to climate mitigation in general, how is that something that we can kind of center and bring to the government's agenda?
I mean, I think that's a huge question, because at the beginning, I want to say maybe around 2017, 2018, you could say that the level of awareness of climate change in Pakistan is probably quite low. But I think that has changed, and largely in part of because we've had so many natural disasters since then, and people are trying to and I think people are now beginning to frame their lived experiences as climate change, and that's important. It's important for people to recognize that. However, at the same time, I think that the most marginal women and women that are most deeply impacted by all of this I don't think they necessarily categorize this as climate change. And I feel like if you want to ensure a participatory approach where these women are being brought to the table, they need to be able to sort of package this experience in a regional vocabulary that they understand, that they can sort of take ownership of and describe their experiences through that. And I've always sort of advocated this, and Sara and I have worked on this as well, which is that where is the regional vocabulary to describe climate change? Maholiyati tabdeeli, I don't know what that means. I mean,
I believe we need to retune ourselves that everyone in Pakistan and in less developed countries are climate experts because they live the experience.
Correct.
It's us as experts who have to retune our ear to be able to listen to them rather than the mostly foreign English-speaking technocrat experts who come and tell us what to do. Everyone hears a climate, just listen to them, and then it's the idea of being able to connect the dots what people are saying and have a voice from the global south really on climate justice. I think it's very important.
Absolutely, and I think that it's becoming quite obvious that these, the amount of gathered knowledge that you could get about the way that the land around them is adapting to climate change or is being impacted by climate change. Weather patterns are becoming increasingly difficult to predict. Look, I mean, we're sitting in April in Pakistan, and probably the longest spring we've had is probably going to be fall, which is, I mean, that sounds nice, but it's probably not such good news in the future, right? And my point is that we're getting watermelons in early March. That has never happened before. And the point is that these women have, yeah, I know, but there's so much information and knowledge that these women have. And the problem is that nobody is sitting and talking to them. And nobody is actually putting together all of this and making indigenous solutions, which could be so much more impactful than something that's worked in, I don't know, Norway. That's not going to happen. And so I think we have to start there.
Absolutely. I think the distinction that you guys have drawn between the terminology of international law versus localized narratives and, like you said, indigenous solutions, I think that really is the way forward. And I think that this conversation has brought together so many different strands, but I think at the end of it, really what has kind of been salient is the fact that we've identified how exactly climate change affects women disproportionately, how it is a gendered issue, how it's not a neutral issue as is commonly perceived, and we've also identified several ways that we can kind of move towards more gendered response in terms of climate action. So I think this conversation will hopefully pave the way for lots of continuing conversations, and hopefully also some conversations in the government when it comes to the constitution of further committees and the appointment of ministers in the future. So that's the hope. But thank you very much for being here today, and thank you very much for your invaluable insights.
It's been fantastic.
Yeah, it's been super fun. Thank you.